This is a wicked woman. And let me say that. And we've always felt that from day one, looking at the Paul Baker case here. And I'm not going to do anything to help her down in Florida. But again, everyone has a right to get under Freedom of Information Act things that they want. Yes, ma'am.
Now, you said that it was a closed case, but that the missing persons case was open. What's closed, and can you expand on that a little?
Paul Baker, well, not Paul, but James Baker and Susan Baker were charged in 2000. Is that correct?
Right. Now, there was an 87 charge as well, but that was...
But the 2000 charges were a result of the 87 investigation.
That's right. That's right.
But there was she was convicted of something that happened back in 87.
That's right.
Between 87 and 2000. And that was assault and battery of a high aggravator.
Yes. And that case is closed.
Okay. The charges that came up in 2000 against both, those charges were a result of work that the cold case squad worked on. That would be Bob and Brian, I think, to a degree, as well as I think we had SLED also working with us for the behavioral science part of SLED. And those charges were made in 2000. And I'll tell you, we charged based on what we felt we had in the form of evidence, which was very, very, very shaky, very limited. And we would have been rolling some serious dice if the solicitor had gone forward with the prosecution on those cases. And here's another problem. We could have rolled the dice back in 2000, but what we felt we may be able to prove. You know, here we got a case where Paul Baker is missing, has been missing since 1987, has never been found, and to the day has never been found. So we don't have a lot of evidence that we could work with, and we didn't have enough evidence to go look at a homicide investigation or what have you. Not that doesn't change. Things change over the years. We're hoping that as a result of what's going on down in Chipley, Florida, that may end up helping us here in Beaufort County with a case from 1987. And those things happen all the time. We have to wait and find out exactly what goes on in Chipley, Florida, what the results are of their investigation, to see if any of what they're doing today and through this investigation could help us here locally and going back to the 1987 case. But in 2000, it was not worth rolling the dice. I'll be honest with you. I mean, because if we had if there had been a not guilty verdict, then it would have been very difficult for us to go back and bring charges, even similar charges, against her, and be successful because of double jeopardy thing. And I'll let the solicitor talk about that.
Well, and I think what's important about that is that there is no statute of limitations for crime in South Carolina, which means that we can go back and charge on a criminal offense at any time if we get additional evidence. If evidence comes out of the investigation right now from the Florida authorities that I believe they have a number of agencies working on, and I'll let the sheriff comment on that if he wants to. If we get additional information, we are willing and legally able to bring an indictment now. There is no statute of limitations in South Carolina, and that's important to understand as well.
Is there any double jeopardy?
There would.
Because my understanding was in 2000, grand jury wouldn't indict.
Right.
And then in 2003, the charges were dropped.
The only way that's a good question. The only way double jeopardy would have attached is if we'd have tried the case and lost it, or for that matter, tried it and won it. And back in 1987, the crime that was true billed by the grand jury that was later dismissed was a 10-year misdemeanor. It didn't carry a particularly large amount of jail time. Because it was a misdemeanor, she would not have done any time in jail if she'd have been convicted of it, or if she would, it would have been very limited. But most important, what would have happened is that jeopardy would have attached. And if jeopardy attaches, you get one shot at this. If jeopardy attaches, I can't go back in and try it again for a similar crime. This way, there's no statute of limitations. We can go in and try her if there's evidence. If there's not evidence, then obviously would not. And we have to wait to see what comes out of the Florida investigation.
So just to make sure I understand, you're basically, depending on what kind of evidence you get out of there, you're free and clear with any charges that you...
That's exactly right. This case has been a cold case since 1987. The sheriff created a cold case department. I worked with Captain Bromage with that. As he was the head of that, and we worked together very well on that years ago. But we are free and clear to do anything in the future on this case if we receive evidence. And that stuff we're just going to have to wait to see what comes out of the Florida investigation.
So you said, I'm a little confused. So what charges were brought about in 2000? I just want to be clear.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Domestic violence of high and aggravated nature charge was presented to the grand jury in 2000, in, I believe, July of 2000. That charge was no-billed by the grand jury. The then neglect of a child charges were presented to the grand jury in December, and those were the charges that we didn't have enough evidence to go forward on.
I think
first one was relating to who?
No, I think based on your question, I think it's important to understand what a no bill is. And I mean, I think
That's good. That's right.
Because if you could explain the no bill, true bill side of it is important.
True bill and no bill is determined by the grand jury. And those are 18 people of the Beaufort community that get together once a month in Beaufort County to determine whether or not there's enough evidence to go forward on a case or not. That is the first step in a criminal justice system after the warrant is obtained. And in order to take a case to trial, the grand jury has to true bill an indictment. And probably roughly 200 indictments are presented to the grand jury every month for every crime that takes place in Beaufort County. That was no billed. The grand jury did not release that to be tried. They sent the message out that there was not enough evidence even for me to consider it for trial. And that was the first set of charges against her. Those were assault. That was, I believe, it was domestic violence of a high and aggravated nature.
Now, keep in mind now that you've got 18 Beaufort County residents that are technically jurors that are reviewing the evidence that's brought in by law enforcement, and the indictment is the vehicle that takes the authority of the solicitor into a court environment to work on a case. Now, if we got 18 jurors, a grand jury, looking at a case that we're wanting to move forward, and they're going, this ain't enough. This ain't good enough to go forward. It kind of gives us a wake-up call, because it tells us, again, like I said earlier, you're rolling some big dice if you look at what double jeopardy is and what a grand jury is looking at and going, this ain't good enough. And like the solicitor says, we got 200 cases a month that go through grand jury, and we end up with maybe one or two that are no billed. The majority are true billed because there's sufficient evidence to support the charge. But even in 2000, when these indictments were drawn up, I think, and Bob and all will agree, it was shaky. There was enough there to get a warrant, but even the grand jury didn't think that there was enough to proceed forward. The first go around, but different statute really came into play, and when that different statute and the elements of that particular statute made it a little more palatable for the grand jury to say, well, the last time you were here, you were a little bit shaky, but this time's a little bit better. Again, do you roll the dice and put yourself in a position of double jeopardy, knowing what we knew about that case, and knowing how much we wanted that case to be solved, and we wanted her held accountable. And I think the judge said not too long back, a person doesn't have any constitutional rights to be liked. Well, she fit that category by us, and we were determined that what case we brought into the court, and I know the solicitor. Who, you weren't the solicitor at the
No,
time,
it's
but
not.
your job was, to do your job. We just felt like this ain't a good gamble. And
Did both Susan and James face those charges
They did.
in the 2007?
They did.
And those charges were against, for what? The criminal...
like, what was the statute? How did it read?
The first one was domestic violence. It was an allegation of whether or not she actually struck the child, I believe. And I'll ask Captain Bromwich, I know he's in, but I think that was correct. The second set of charges was a neglect statute, which back in 1997, which has been changed since then.
Well, it's
But
87 statute.
it had to go back. You have to go back to 87 law. And that was an unlawful neglect statute. At that time was a misdemeanor. It carried a maximum of 10 years. Quite frankly, we were hoping to be able to get some more evidence. And we are, because of the position that we put ourselves back then, we're still able to get additional evidence.
And you're talking about Paul in this case. This
talking-
has nothing to do with the
Right.
sister.
Right, that's right. That's correct.
Both
That's
of those,
correct.
That's right. I'm sorry.
That's right.
Is this the first significant development in that case, or has there been anything since 2002 in the cold case?
No, this is really. She didn't necessarily go underground, but I know that Bob's been keeping. This is still a cold case. The Paul Baker case is still a cold case. That phase of the investigation when they were charged, that part of it's been closed out. It's still a part of the overall case, and we can go back and take portions of that investigation or parts of that case and apply them to others, just like we could do here in this particular case here out of Florida. But for the most part, she was not on the radar screen as being active, because there was no new leads or nothing really new coming out of how she was leading her life up until the 31st of October that was on the radar for us. But the case was still cold. Then it's a case that Bob still has. We don't know what will come out of Chipley, Florida. We don't know if anything that's going on in Florida will help with the Paul Baker case. We'll just have to wait and see.
Are you at liberty to discuss the evidence that brought them to be extradited back here, or is that something you're holding on to hopes?
Yeah, I think we need to keep that,
Okay.
kind of quiet, because those are the things that really don't need to be released right now. I think there will be a point in time where absolutely it will be a part of the discussion.
Knowing what you know about Susan Baker, were you very shocked and surprised to find that baby alive?
Knowing what I know about her, and going back in 1987, I was on a search team in 1987 when Paul Baker was missing, and knowing her involvement down in Florida, and then Bob and I were actually together. We had a meeting in Columbia yesterday, and when we started getting more information about what was going on and try to get things set in motion, and Bob and I both felt like if she was involved, we would never find the child, because of our knowledge of her in Beaufort County and Paul Baker. And then here we go again, she's involved, and the child's not going to be found.
At what point did you know that might be the same Susan Baker?
Early yesterday morning.
Who tipped you off to that, or was it law enforcement?
We got multiple tips. FDLE was in contact with Bob. Our website, we got emails to our website. Bob started getting phone calls on his cell phone because of his phone number and all his other information being on the website because of being a cold case section. So, and once they started, it started pouring in, and as the morning and as the afternoon progressed, even with the example is basically clear here. The media, I think Robin, as well as Bob, and we started getting a lot of media questions about lunchtime yesterday, 1 o'clock yesterday, and then from there it's kind of taken a life of its own, and here we are today. Because the dots started being connected, I think probably late Monday, or no, excuse me, Tuesday, and then really started. The dots really got connected yesterday.
Is there an expectation that somebody in either of y'all's office is going to get to question her at some point?
We've got an investigator in Florida right now.
Does he have an opportunity to talk to her, or will he have it?
No, he's had. He's been a part of the interview team. He's working with Washington County Sheriff's Office and Florida Department of Law Enforcement.
What's his name?
Brian Baird.
And down there helping them with their case, or
Both.
do you expect anything to come about concerning this case here?
I would hope something would come about. I mean, I don't know what to expect in this situation. We're extremely happy that the child was found alive. Bottom line, that's the most important thing out of it. Again, I mean, even the circumstances in this particular case are awful. But the fact that the child is alive, we breathe, it was a definite sigh for all because of what our exposure to this woman was in 1987 would call. It was a surprise the child was found alive, and we found out this at 12:30 last night.
Right around there.
Yeah.
Do you know if there's any evidence that the mother knew any of Susan Baker's history? I saw in the news something about her being an aunt.
Well, all those things are being evaluated, and that's again one of the reasons why Brian is in Florida,
Right.
because he's working and helping as much as he can there on their case, but he's also, I mean, he was one of the lead investigators on the Paul Baker case in 1987. He knows the case inside and out. He's also looking at this investigation as well.
Anything else?
And you said you were on the search team. What can you tell us that you remember about being out there when this first happened?
In 1987, I ran the narcotics division for the sheriff's office, and we had all our drug team members were out, and we were doing massive land searches because you have to take into consideration in 1987 and what the claim was at the time. We didn't know if a 3-year-old child had walked away from the house and just didn't know where. Didn't know if the child had walked when it was in the woods or had been picked up by a stranger. I mean, everything. We were looking at every possible angle as to why this child is missing and who's responsible. So, I mean, there was a bunch of, there was a lot of searching going on throughout Beaufort County, and that's what my group at the time basically was doing land searches.
Even at the time, was a primary suspicion that it was a murder, that you were hoping to find the body at that point?
Well, we didn't know what we had in 19. Well, and it takes a long time, and it's pretty obvious here. I mean, the child in Florida came up missing, I believe, on the 31st of October. And then, it takes a few days to try to work your way through, especially in the investigation side, as you've got so many people to interview and so many stories are being told. You've got to evaluate everything that's coming in, and you've got to look at every possible angle, and you've got to evaluate every piece of evidence you come across, or potentially could be evidence. But you really got to focus in on what people are saying, and that's with any investigation. And again, it's just like with the solicitor having to make a decision back in 2000. Do we roll the dice on this case or not? I think Solicitor Murdoch had one of the better sayings: when you investigate the devil, you got to go to hell for your witnesses. We didn't have a lot of good witnesses in this case back in 2000 to roll those dice. She is. She's a wicked person. That's as nice as I can be.
I don't know who this is a question for, but those charges with the child abuse that she was actually charged and pled guilty to for the daughter?
Back in 1987?
Yes.
Right.
Now, that was a 10-year sentence, is that right? But she only served 8 months? Or,
I think that's correct. I'll have to check on the records of that. Is that what it was, 80 days?
10 years suspended to 80 days with 5 years probation.
Yeah. I was in law school during that time. It's hard for me to tell you exactly what happened.
Has that, with the suspended sentence, how is she now in jeopardy of having to serve more of that time now? Or?
The most you can put anybody on probation for is 5 years.
Okay.
So the 5 years would have run at the end of the
Under time
92. Regardless. That's the most anyone can receive in South Carolina. But again, this has been as far as the disappearance, and that's a different matter concerning, as opposed to the disappearance of Paul Baker. That case has been in cold case status since 1987. And any information that we gather, we are still free to go forward with if we get any more information. And I think it is important to realize that in South Carolina we don't have a statute of limitations. There's nothing that prevents us from bringing charges if Detective Beard comes back with some information that can help. To this date, we still do not know what happened to the child, and that makes it very difficult to prosecute. But we are free to prosecute if we receive information and we've received credible evidence. And that was a decision we had to make, I guess it's in March of 2003, as whether or not we could ever develop enough evidence to prosecute her. And at that time, we didn't.
I mean, there are a lot of cold cases, just to understand what cold case, there are a lot of cold cases or cases that will go unsolved, period. And there are others that 10, 20, 30 years are solved. No secret is good forever. And people talk. And they talk at different stages and different things that are going on in our life. And, we as investigators, we as law enforcement, we're looking for those opportunities. And, some of the cold cases that Bob's worked on and has solved are because of mistakes made by the defendants or the suspects. We just have to be there ready to pick up on that mistake. And of course, we're hoping that we'll be able to, that things will develop through what's going on in Florida that will help us here in South Carolina.
Was the intent in 2000, 2003 to try them together?
Well, that presented another problem as well. They were our two main witnesses as well as the two defendants, and so at that point that would have been a tough decision as well.
And they were married. So
they had a privilege against testifying against them. I could not have forced them to testify against the other anyway, and that was another problem we had with the issue then. But here's the other thing. Like I said, the case has been cold since '87. The sheriff's office has never given up on this. They've never quit, and they've never forgotten. And the disadvantage that if there was harm that came to Paul Baker, the disadvantage is that we're all still here, and we all still remember. And we are absolutely legally free to move forward at any point if we get the evidence to do so, and we will.